At 81 years old, Roger Waters has finally broken his silence on his relationship with David Gilmour, and what he revealed has left fans shocked and divided. After decades of tension, it seemed like things might finally change, but the truth is far more complicated. What really happened behind closed doors? Join us as we uncover the full story and reveal what this means for the future of Pink Floyd. The seeds of discontent. The story of Roger Waters and David Gilmour's feud really begins in the late 1970s, right in the heart of Pink Floyd's most successful years. While the band had already released masterpieces like The Dark Side of the Moon and Wish You Were Here, things behind the scenes were changing quickly. By the time Pink Floyd started work on their 1977 album Animals, Roger Waters was clearly becoming the dominant creative force in the group, and that shift didn't sit well with David Gilmour. Animals was a dark, politically charged record. It was Roger Waters' concept, almost entirely shaped by his vision. He wrote most of the music and all of the lyrics and controlled the direction of the sessions. Gilmour, who had been one of the key creative contributors on earlier albums, started to feel pushed aside. He wasn't given much room to add his musical ideas to the songs, except for his guitar solos. Gilmour was also frustrated because, by this time, he had started working on his own solo material. He brought some of those ideas to the Animals sessions, hoping they might become Pink Floyd songs. Instead, Waters rejected them, deciding they didn't fit with his vision for the album. Some of those ideas would later end up on Gilmour's first solo album, which he released in 1978. Another sore point for Gilmour was the songwriting credits. Animals was almost entirely written by Waters, except for the track Dogs, which listed both Waters and Gilmour as co-writers. Gilmour's contribution to Dogs was significant. He wrote much of the music and sang the lead vocals, but that was the only major recognition he got on the whole album. Given Gilmour's role in shaping the sound of Pink Floyd up to that point, this shift left him feeling more like a hired hand than a true creative partner. The atmosphere during the making of Animals was tense. The sessions were described as isolated, with band members often working separately. The friendly, open collaboration of earlier albums was gone. Roger Waters was increasingly taking control, and his intense, perfectionist approach was starting to drive a wedge between him and the rest of the band. Then came the infamous spitting incident. During Pink Floyd's In the Flesh tour for Animals, tensions between the band and their audience also reached a boiling point. On July 6, 1977, during a show in Montreal, Waters completely lost his temper with the crowd. Frustrated by noisy, unruly fans lighting fireworks and shouting during quiet moments of the performance, Waters leaned down from the stage and actually spat on one of them. This shocking moment became a symbol of Waters' growing frustration, not just with the audience, but with the entire machinery of the rock music industry. He later described the event as a personal low point. It disturbed him so much that it inspired his next big concept, building a metaphorical wall between himself and the audience, which would soon become the idea behind the wall. But while Waters was starting to create his next artistic masterpiece, the relationships inside Pink Floyd were falling apart. By the time Pink Floyd began working on the wall, Roger Waters was fully in charge. He wrote almost all the music and every single lyric. He shaped the story, controlled the recording process, and directed how the songs were going to sound. The rest of the band, including Gilmour, were largely just helping to bring his vision to life. It wasn't just about control over the music. Waters also wanted control over the people involved. One of the most dramatic moments during the sessions was his decision to push keyboardist Rick Wright out of the band. Waters accused Wright of not contributing enough and of being more interested in sailing than recording. Under pressure, Wright was forced to resign from the band during the making of The Wall. Strangely, Wright was then hired back, but only as a paid session musician for the tour, not as a full member of the band anymore. David Gilmour, meanwhile, still found ways to make important contributions, especially as a guitarist. One of the most famous Pink Floyd songs, Comfortably Numb, wouldn't be the same without Gilmour's soaring guitar solo. In fact, Gilmour co-wrote that song with Waters, and the two famously argued over how it should sound. Waters wanted it slower and darker, while Gilmour wanted it more emotional and uplifting. In the end, the song became a mix of both, but Gilmour's guitar playing was what truly made it legendary. By the time Pink Floyd made the final cut in 1983, things were beyond repair. The album is often described as more of a Roger Waters solo project than a real Pink Floyd album. Waters wrote every word and every note. The lyrics were deeply personal, dealing with his anger about war, politics, and the death of his father in World War II. David Gilmour was almost entirely sidelined during these sessions. He clashed with Waters constantly about the material, feeling that the songs were too focused on Waters' personal feelings and not really fitting for Pink Floyd as a band. Gilmour publicly criticized the album later, calling it weak and unfinished. The communication between them had completely broken down by this point. Waters openly dismissed Gilmour's contributions, and Gilmour didn't hide his frustration with Waters' controlling attitude. Even Nick Mason, the band's drummer, admitted that he often felt like an outsider during the making of the final cut. This period marked the true breaking point. The creative partnership between Waters and Gilmour, once one of the most powerful in rock music, had fallen apart completely. Pink Floyd, at least in the form that fans knew and loved, was essentially dead. The breakup and legal warfare. In 1985, Roger Waters officially announced that he was done with Pink Floyd. He told the other members, and later the public, that he was leaving the band because he felt they had run out of ideas. In his words, Pink Floyd was a spent force creatively. As far as Waters was concerned, the band was over, and there was no point in continuing under the name. Waters also believed that because he had been the main creative mind behind their last few albums, especially The Wall and The Final Cut, he was Pink Floyd. To him, the idea of David Gilmour or Nick Mason continuing with the name without him felt wrong. He saw it as dishonest to the fans and damaging to the band's legacy. But David Gilmour didn't agree. He didn't see Pink Floyd as Roger Waters' property. Gilmour argued that the band had always been a group project, with contributions from all members, including the early work of Syd Barrett, Rick Wright, and himself. He wasn't ready to let it die just because Waters wanted out. That's when things got ugly. Once Waters realized that Gilmour and Mason planned to continue using the Pink Floyd name, he took legal action to try and stop them. He filed a lawsuit in 1986, aiming to prevent the remaining members from performing or releasing music as Pink Floyd. Waters argued that without him, they were not the real band and had no right to use the name. Gilmour and Mason didn't back down. They fought back in court, countersuing to protect their right to carry on as Pink Floyd. It wasn't just about pride, it was also about business. Pink Floyd was one of the biggest rock bands in the world, and the name was worth millions. The legal fight quickly turned into a full-scale war between former friends and bandmates. One of the major turning points in the fight was when Gilmour and Mason began recording a new album, A Momentary Lapse of Reason, in 1987. Waters threatened to take out injunctions to block the album's release and to stop them from going on tour using the Pink Floyd name. He argued that by using the name, they were misleading fans and cashing in on the work he had done. The situation dragged on for months. Lawyers on both sides exchanged paperwork, while Gilmour and Mason continued working in the studio, determined to prove that Pink Floyd could still make good music without Waters. Behind the scenes, the record company was nervous. Pink Floyd was still a huge name, and any delays or legal problems could mean major financial losses. There was a lot of pressure on everyone involved to reach some kind of deal. Finally, in late 1987, the two sides reached a legal settlement. The agreement allowed David Gilmour and Nick Mason to continue using the Pink Floyd name. In return, Roger Waters got full rights to certain key parts of the band's legacy, including the wall and its related imagery. That meant Waters had the sole right to perform the wall as a major live show and use its distinctive graphics, such as the marching hammers and the teacher character. For Gilmour, the victory was huge. He could now lead Pink Floyd into a new era without worrying about more lawsuits from Waters. For Waters, the result was mixed. He had kept control over the concept that mattered most to him, the wall, but he had lost the bigger fight over the name. It was a hard pill to swallow. Waters later admitted that the lawsuit was probably a mistake. In interviews years later, he said that trying to stop Gilmour and Mason from using the Pink Floyd name didn't really work out the way he had hoped. However, even though he admitted some regret, he often added qualifiers. He believed that morally, he had been right, even if it didn't work legally. This bitterness stayed with him for decades. Waters felt that the band's later success without him was built on a lie, while Gilmour saw it as simply moving forward. Waters' feelings about the whole situation remained complicated long after the courts had made their decision. Over the years, he gave interviews where he said that Gilmour and Mason had stolen the name from him. He believed that they had continued to trade on his creative work while offering very little of their own. At the same time, Waters also admitted that the fight had cost him both emotionally and personally. The legal war damaged friendships that might never have been repaired. Even when he reunited with the band for short moments later on, like at Live 8 in 2005, the old wounds never fully healed. Meanwhile, Gilmour mostly avoided speaking in detail about the legal fight. He often preferred to focus on the music rather than the conflict. But when he did speak about it, he stood by the decision to keep Pink Floyd going, saying that it was the right thing to do for the fans and for himself. Competing Pink Floyds. The late 1980s and early 1990s became a strange time for Pink Floyd fans. Instead of one band, there were now two powerful forces releasing albums, going on tours, and fighting in the press. Each side wanted to prove they were the true heart of Pink Floyd. The battle really kicked off when both Waters and Gilmour released new albums in 1987, A Momentary Lapse of Reason from Gilmour's Pink Floyd and Radio KAOS from Waters. These two albums became rivals by default, representing two visions of what Pink Floyd could be. A Momentary Lapse of Reason was a carefully crafted attempt to keep the Pink Floyd sound alive. Even though Waters was gone, Gilmour worked hard to make sure that the album still felt like Pink Floyd. He brought back Nick Mason on drums, even though Mason wasn't very active on the recordings, and surrounded himself with top studio musicians to fill the gaps left by Waters and Wright, who wasn't yet officially back in the band. The result was a polished, atmospheric album with Gilmour's signature guitars sound front and center. Songs like Learning to Fly and On the Turning Away helped reassure fans that Pink Floyd could still deliver emotional, spacey, and powerful rock music. Meanwhile, Roger Waters' Radio KAOS was a concept album about a disabled man named Billy, who could hear radio waves and ends up speaking to the world through a radio station. Like much of Waters' work, it was political, critical of modern society, and full of big ideas. But musically, it didn't connect with fans the way A Momentary Lapse of Reason did. Many people found it hard to follow, and its singles didn't get much radio play compared to Gilmour's album. When it came to public perception, it wasn't even close. Gilmour's Pink Floyd won the popularity contest. A Momentary Lapse of Reason sold millions of copies, went multi-platinum, and helped push the band back into the center of the rock world. Waters, on the other hand, found himself struggling to draw the same size crowds and attention. This only made Waters angrier. To him, Gilmour's version of Pink Floyd was an imposter Floyd, a fake group pretending to be something they weren't. He believed the new Pink Floyd albums were shallow, empty of meaning, and mostly just a commercial trick using the band's famous name. Waters felt that he had built Pink Floyd's legacy with The Dark Side of the Moon, Wish You Were Here, and The Wall. And now Gilmour was using that legacy for money and fame. If the album rivalry wasn't enough, the competition continued on the live stage. Pink Floyd launched a massive world tour to support A Momentary Lapse of Reason, which eventually became the live album Delicate Sound of Thunder. These concerts were a huge success, with sold-out arenas and massive crowds around the world. The band's famous light shows, lasers, and giant inflatables were all there, giving fans the spectacle they expected from Pink Floyd shows. Meanwhile, Roger Waters continued his solo tour for Radio KAOS, but it was clear that his shows weren't drawing the same attention. His concerts were smaller, the venues weren't always full, and critics gave mixed reviews to the concept-heavy performance. Waters was growing more bitter with each passing year, as he watched Gilmour's Pink Floyd become a global success, while his own career struggled to keep pace. But in 1990, Waters had his chance to make a grand statement. To mark the fall of the Berlin Wall, he organized The Wall, live in Berlin, a massive concert staged at Potsdamer Platz in Berlin. It was one of the largest concerts ever held, with an audience of over 350,000 people and millions more watching on television. Waters brought in guest performers like Cyndi Lauper, Bryan Adams, and Van Morrison to help bring his vision of The Wall to life. The Wall, Live in Berlin, was meant to show the world that Waters could still deliver a major event, and that The Wall belonged to him. But even with its size and ambition, the performance didn't fully reconnect Waters to his old fan base. Many Pink Floyd fans were disappointed that Gilmour, Mason, and Wright weren't involved, and some felt that the star-studded lineup made the show feel more like a TV special than a true Pink Floyd concert. As both sides moved forward, the press kept stirring the pot. Interviews with Waters often included sharp comments about Gilmour. He would call the new Pink Floyd albums weak, empty, and lacking vision. Waters constantly reminded interviewers that he had written The Dark Side of the Moon, The Wall, and Wish You Were Here, as if trying to reclaim the Pink Floyd brand for himself in the eyes of the public. Gilmour, for his part, usually stayed more reserved but didn't hide his annoyance. He defended his decision to continue Pink Floyd and often suggested that Waters was simply bitter about how things had turned out. Occasionally, Gilmour would make small, cutting remarks, but generally, he preferred to let the music speak for itself. A brief truce. By 2005, it had been over 2 decades since Roger Waters had last performed with David Gilmour, Nick Mason, and Richard Wright as Pink Floyd. The wounds from the breakup and years of public fights were still fresh. Nobody really expected them to play together again. But then came Live 8, a massive benefit concert organized by Bob Geldof to raise awareness about poverty and debt in Africa. Geldof, who had played a key role in the Wall movie years earlier, was determined to get Pink Floyd back together for this one special event. For fans around the world, this moment felt almost impossible. After years of bitterness, legal fights, and insults, how could these 4 men share the same stage again? The answer is simple: a lot of behind-the-scenes effort, persistence, and negotiation. Bob Geldof played a major role in making this reunion happen. He personally reached out to Roger Waters first, knowing that Waters might be the hardest to convince. Surprisingly, Waters was open to the idea. Over the years, he had started softening his public stance a bit, occasionally saying he would consider a reunion for a good cause. The real challenge was David Gilmour. Gilmour didn't want anything to do with a Pink Floyd reunion. He had spent the last couple of decades building a separate life from Waters and didn't like the idea of getting dragged back into old fights. But Geldof and others kept asking. Eventually, Gilmour agreed. Not for Waters, not for Pink Floyd's legacy, but for the cause. It wasn't about repairing friendships. It was about doing something positive for the world, and Gilmour could respect that. With Gilmour on board, the others quickly followed. Nick Mason and Richard Wright were easier to convince. though everyone knew the big story was the relationship between Waters and Gilmour. Getting all 4 original members of Pink Floyd into the same room for rehearsals was historic, but it wasn't exactly a happy reunion. Reports from people close to the rehearsals described the atmosphere as tense. Waters and Gilmour barely spoke to each other. Any conversations they did have were short, direct, and strictly about the music. Even though they had agreed to perform, the old resentments were still there under the surface. The rehearsals were professional but cold. There were no hugs, no laughs, no signs of old friendships being restored. This was a businesslike truce for one night only. On July 2, 2005, at London's Hyde Park, Pink Floyd finally reunited on stage. The set list was short but powerful. Speak to Me, Breathe, Money, Wish You Were Here, and Comfortably Numb. Comfortably Numb was the emotional peak of the set. Gilmour's guitar solo on that song is one of the most famous in rock history, and when he played it that night, the sound was as soaring and moving as ever. But even in that moment, the tension between Gilmour and Waters was noticeable. They stood apart on stage, their body language showing that this wasn't a happy family reunion. Still, for millions of fans, it didn't matter. The music was what mattered, and hearing those songs performed by the original members was unforgettable. At the end of the performance, the 4 members came together at the front of the stage and briefly hugged, but even that felt slightly forced. It was a show of unity for the cameras, but underneath, not much had really changed between Waters and Gilmour. After Live 8, fans were hopeful that maybe this could lead to something bigger, a tour, a new album, or at least a few more performances together. Roger Waters himself added fuel to that hope. In interviews afterward, he suggested that he would be open to more reunions. He talked about how good it had felt to play those songs again and mentioned that they could possibly do more in the future. But David Gilmour quickly shut that idea down. In the days following the concert, Gilmour was clear with reporters. "That's it for me. Done." He said that while he was glad they had done it for a good cause, he didn't see any future for them as a working band. For Gilmour, Pink Floyd's story was finished, and Live 8 was simply a nice way to close that chapter for good. Social media wars. By the mid-2010s, it was clear that the rivalry between Waters and Gilmour was alive and well. Both Waters and Gilmour were still active musicians during this time, touring the world with their own bands. In 2017, Waters launched his Us Plus Them tour, a huge high-tech show that featured a mix of classic Pink Floyd songs and his solo material. The show had powerful political themes, especially criticizing Donald Trump and global inequality, 2 topics Waters regularly spoke about. The production was huge, full of striking visuals and sharp political messages, much like his previous The Wall tour. At the same time, David Gilmour was doing his own thing. He released his solo album Rattle That Lock in 2015 and toured major venues across Europe, and the US Gilmour's shows were more focused on music than politics. His concerts mixed Pink Floyd classics like Comfortably Numb and Wish You Were Here with his newer solo songs. It was clear that while Waters wanted to use his platform for activism, Gilmour preferred letting the music speak for itself. Though they weren't mentioning each other by name, their interviews were full of indirect digs. Waters would often take subtle shots at Gilmour, suggesting that Gilmour's contributions to Pink Floyd were mostly about guitar sounds, while Waters himself had provided the heart and meaning behind the band's greatest work. Gilmour, in contrast, gave cool, brief replies when asked about Waters, usually avoiding getting drawn into long fights, but making it clear that he wanted no part of a working relationship with his former bandmate. One of the biggest flare-ups between them during the 2010s was about Pink Floyd's official website and social media platforms. As far as Roger Waters was concerned, even though he was a founding member and wrote much of the band's most famous material, he felt like he was being shut out of the official Pink Floyd brand. Fans visiting the Pink Floyd website or following their official social media pages would mostly see posts about Gilmour's solo projects or old Floyd content, but nothing about Waters' work. Waters didn't stay quiet about this. In 2020, he posted a video on YouTube directly addressing the issue. Sitting in his home, calm but clearly annoyed, Waters accused Gilmour of effectively banning him from using the Pink Floyd platforms to promote his own music or political projects. He argued that it was unfair to the band's legacy and unfair to the fans, many of whom cared about both sides of the story. He made it clear that the feud was still ongoing behind the scenes, no matter how polite things might seem from the outside. Roger Waters breaks his silence. For years, fans of Pink Floyd had wondered if Roger Waters and David Gilmour would ever find a way to fix their broken relationship. After decades of arguments, lawsuits, and cold interviews, it seemed impossible. But in 2020, during an interview with Rolling Stone, Roger Waters finally broke his silence about a surprising effort he had made to repair things. He called it his Big Peace Plan. During the interview, Waters revealed that he and Gilmour had actually spoken in June of that year. This wasn't just a friendly chat. It was a proper meeting with a serious goal. Waters said he came up with a full plan to finally make peace between them, after all the bitterness that had built up over the years. He wanted to find a way for both of them to coexist peacefully, especially when it came to managing the Pink Floyd name and legacy. One of Waters' main complaints was about the control Gilmour seemed to have over the official Pink Floyd website and platforms. Waters explained that he wasn't allowed to promote his Us Plus Them concert film on the band's official site. According to him, Gilmour censored it, making sure that nothing from Waters' solo career could be shared through Pink Floyd's channels. This clearly upset Waters. After all, he had written much of the band's most famous music, yet he felt shut out of his own history. Waters said he offered the peace plan in good faith. He admitted he wanted to clear the air and put the fighting behind them, at least in terms of professional matters. But it didn't work. The peace plan came to nothing, and Waters shared that disappointment openly with Rolling Stone. He didn't get angry about it during the interview. He sounded more tired, maybe even defeated, like someone who had tried but had given up hope. The emotional tone of the interview stood out. Waters knew that fans around the world had always dreamed of seeing the classic Pink Floyd members together again. He addressed that directly, saying, "I bet all Pink Floyd fans are sorry to hear that. They all hoped that we could kiss and make up, and everything would be wonderful in a cozy, wonderful world." There was a mix of sarcasm in his words, but also real sadness. Waters understood how important this band was to people. He also seemed to understand that many would see this as a missed opportunity. If you enjoyed this video, make sure to like, subscribe, and drop a comment sharing your favorite Pink Floyd album.